So I think the first question we might want to address in the very beginning is what is orchestration really?
Orchestration can be thought of in two different aspects. So if you're talking about professional orchestrations where you hear someone saying, I'm an orchestrator, that means that they take someone else's music and they prepare it to be played by a live orchestra, usually. So, for example, John Williams is one of his orchestrators is Conrad Pope. And how that works, I was lucky enough to be in one of Conrad Pope's workshops, I think in 2014, no, 2012 in a Hollywood Music Workshop in Vienna. As I remember, he explained that John Williams uses 6 to 8 staves in his sketches. So he would use 2 staves for woodwinds, 2 staves for brass, 2 staves for strings, and then 2 staves, for example, for auxiliary instruments. So Conrad Pope would take that sketch and then, expand it to full orchestra. So, for example, John Williams and the 2 staves for the woodwinds, he would write a line like a melody, and he would write on top, for example, flute, and then you would have chords on the bottom, for example. And, because they've been working for so long, Conrad would know what kind of instruments John was imagining. So, for example, I also have a lot of music orchestrated by other people with my projects. And what they do is when I create a MIDI mockup, I send them the MIDI, I send them my Cubase project, and it's basically already fully orchestrated in my project. But still, someone needs to take the MIDI and put it into sheet music for the musicians then to play live at a recording session. So that's if you're speaking about like professional orchestration when someone says, I'm an orchestrator. But when you're speaking about orchestration in the term of composition, that is basically you creating your own arrangement per se of your own music. And if you're speaking about orchestration, about the science, we can say the art or a science of how to make the orchestra sound as uniform as possible, or like how to make the orchestra sound in as many different colors as possible. And certain rules do apply for specific styles of music. And some rules that I also explain in my courses, like the rule of thirds, like not having too much thirds in the orchestration, for example, basically apply throughout any styles. So if I would like kind of now dumb it down, dilute everything I said down, I would say, yeah, maybe that orchestration is an art and science of how to make the orchestra sound well.
Mm. Yeah, that's well
that
put.
Makes sense.
Yeah, so
I'm quite sure there's another definition online, but
yeah, you're basically arranging your music for the orchestra and trying to make it sound as cohesive and as balanced as possible. Pretty much.
Yeah, exactly. Well said. And also you will hear people say that there's like certain stages of music composition, that first comes like a sketch, and then you orchestrate that sketch, and then you go, let's say if you're working in DAW and you're all like, then you do the mock-up, and then you do the mixing, and then you do the mastering. Like all of these stages, for me, when you come to a certain level, become like the same stage. So I don't, for example, do sketches anymore. Like I just go immediately to orchestra. I do my mixing while I do my writing. So as a beginner, maybe these stages are helpful, but then they all, come together into basically one cohesive stage that's basically just called composing.
Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense. And that's kind of the same for a lot of people, or every person I've talked to that has quite significant experience, that everything blends into one thing, because every step that you're taking early on has to be made with the end result in mind. So you have to think of the mix as you're composing and as you're arranging and so on. So with that said, how important do you feel the orchestration process is for the end result and the end mix?
Well, it's extremely important, because if your orchestration will be flawed, and let's say that you're still like, you're writing music in these stages, you first like orchestrate your piano sketch and then you think about the mixing. When you're going to come up to the mix stage, because your orchestration will be flawed, you'll be trying to compensate in the mix, and you'll be trying to like clean out frequencies that are basically there only because your original orchestration was flawed. For example, you had 4/3 in a chord. That chord will sound muddy no matter what you do in the mix. So I think it's extremely important.
Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense.
If you like go online, if you go on YouTube and like you search people of, you know, making MIDI mockups, even just out of Sibelius and using Note Performer, which is like a add-on to Sibelius that you can use to make their sounds sound slightly better. And you see the screen grabs of, let's say, Tchaikovsky and just Note Performer through Sibelius playing it, and you say, oh, wow, that sounds good. And it sounds good because Tchaikovsky's orchestrations were already so good. So even like bad sample libraries with a really good, strong piece and strong orchestration make sound great. I mean, not great, but sound good because the orchestration is so strong.
Yeah, I feel that's probably a very common mistake a lot of beginners kind of make, is thinking that the mixing stage is where you fix the issues of balance and of like a buildup of frequencies or things like that. Whereas if you actually do your job properly during the arranging and orchestration phase and the sound selection, then probably 90% of the issues that usually occur in beginner mixes can be just removed, like not having too many thirds and so on.
Yeah, so for example, my assistant that I have now, he would start a track and I would help him finish it. And if he starts on my template, I tell him that he has one rule, that he cannot open the mixer. So he has to do everything with, you know, just the MIDI and the instruments that I have already loaded, and then only the CC1, CC11, CC7, CC2. So nothing in the mixer, because I know that my template sounds already well on its own, only with the MIDI. So if something's wrong, then that means something is wrong in either his programming or either his orchestration.
Yeah, that is a really good exercise that probably more people should try out, because one, the orchestra is basically being refined to just sound as balanced as possible over the last 500 years or so. So if you do the orchestration right, it's going to sound balanced. It's just how it's set up with the amount of instruments and how they're laid out and the distance and everything. So
exactly.
Yeah, and when you have good sample libraries, that means that sound is being replicated as well as possible as well. So ideally, you should be able to get a balanced and powerful sound, not really touching your mixers. That's probably something that I think a lot of people would benefit from doing, like that kind of exercise.
If you have like a template set up, and people can even watch the YouTube or the video that Evenant posted of one of my courses where I set up a template, and I think it's free on YouTube. And if they kind of set up the template that way and then just leave the mixer alone and just try to write a piece, like all the issues will really show up, because you won't have the benefit of like tweaking your faders and adding effects or whatever. You'll really have to like fine tune your orchestration and your programming to make it sound as well as possible, as you said.
Yeah, because if anyone's been to a live orchestral concert, and now we're talking about purely orchestral music, of course, it should sound balanced, because when you're at a live orchestral concert, there's no mixer sitting there mixing the live audio like it is at a rock concert. The orchestra, it's perfectly balanced, and of course with help from the perfect orchestrations from whatever composer they're performing from. So that is definitely, I think, a good goal for people to have, is to make it sound as balanced as possible. Just with a good template really is important as well, because if the template isn't set up right, then that's going to be challenging. Yeah, so definitely recommend checking out the video, because your template is I really enjoyed the way you've set it up. It sounds really natural, it sounds really rich, and it sounds really kind of realistic out of the box, of course, also thanks to the libraries that you're using. So maybe just quickly, if you could touch on some of your favorite libraries for purely orchestral music that you're using these days.
Well, I think like you can go read forums on Facebook and there's like various opinions. But if I would be starting out right now, I would just get this everything for the from the Cinematic Studio series. The woodwinds, the brass, and the strings. First off, all of the libraries are great. Second, all of the libraries were recorded in the same way and are programmed in the same way, which means that you only really need to learn how to program one, that you will be able to know how to program the other one. They're so similar and they just, all of them sound great. So I can't wait for them to come out with a percussion. So most of my, in my template, most of my strings, most of my woodwinds, and most of my brass is Cinematic Studio series. Then because I have so many libraries, I will sometimes, want a more roomy horn and I'll go with the Spitfire symphonic brass horns, for example. But those are really nuances that like a newcomer shouldn't really focus on. So get the Cinematic Studio series and then you're 80% there.
So speaking of beginners, what are some of the most common mistakes that you see or hear in the orchestrations or compositions of people that are just starting out?
In orchestration, the first mistake is what I also go through in all of my workshops and courses is the use of thirds. So ideally, there should be 1/3 per chord, and I go in depth in my strings reloaded course why that is the case. But in short, it's because of the harmonic system. And with every third that you are putting in the chord, you are putting a lot of dissonance in the chord in the higher harmonics, making it sound muddy. And the more thirds you have, the more of these dissonances pile up. And of course, there are like exceptions to this rule. And in the future workshops, especially when I finally get time to do my brass reloaded orchestration course, I will talk about more when the use of more than 1/3 is like applicable. But that is one mistake. And then the other mistake, I would say, and it's not really a mistake, but it's a lack of, is the lack of use of octaves. So I hear compositions of newcomers where I hear that they want to make, the big epic finale of their piece. And they have the violins playing in their highest register, the melody of the piece. And then everyone else is playing chords. And the melody is only in the most highest register of the violins. And it just doesn't sound full. And they probably are thinking, why doesn't it sound full? Well, like if you want to bring something out, especially the melody, like double it in octaves. Like if your first violins are in like the C5 register, then have the second violins playing exactly what the first violins are playing, 1 octave lower in the C4 register, have the violis playing the same melody octave lower in the C3 register, and the cellos in the C2 register. And you can have melody in 4 octaves, plus you can double the violi with the horns, you can double the cellos with the bassoons. Just like if you want to bring your melody out, double it in octaves. And that's always going to work.
It's great advice. And I kind of feel like that advice and the problem with thirds are kind of two sides of the same coin, because it's not kind of understanding how the overtones work and how octaves resonate with one another. Because that's something I talked about in a workshop as well. Actually looking at the overtones of different notes, and especially the octaves. Because when you layer octaves on top of one another, at any given note that's being played, except for a sine wave, the next overtone, the first one, is going to be the octave above, and then a fifth, and then another octave. So whenever you stack the octaves, you're basically just like kind of, the overtones are just overlapping and just resonating with one another and reinforcing the entire kind of vertical structure that is happening. And that goes for, in the low end, you ideally want, maybe octaves there as well, between, say, bass trombones or like low brass instruments, strings. Make sure you don't have like very narrow voicings in the low end, because that again is going to create a lot of clash of overtones. And
even like in the mock-ups, it's like, of course it works. But like with live orchestra, it works even well because you have to think, let's say you have a 60-piece string orchestra and everyone except the bassist is playing the melody in octaves. So when the cellos play the melody in the octaves, and if the orchestra is in tune, it will actually resonate the body of the instrument of the violins, and it would resonate the body of the instrument of the violas, and it would resonate with the whole body of the orchestra. So that's why, like, listening to it live in a stage, you can really hear when the orchestra is in tune. It acts as a whole body. So I don't know, maybe this is like a next level, but maybe people should look into, for example, the Indian sitar. I don't know how many strings it has, but I think it has like 12 or even 24 sympathetic strings that are just like tuned in octaves.
At least like 11. Well, it depends on the model, I think. I have a set of strings here, I need to restring it.
Oh, you have one.
I have two.
So maybe you can but basically whatever you play on the sitar, it would resonate all the sympathetic strings that are basically not played. And that's why you get that wow, nice, like kind of almost major sounding chord in the background of the sitar, because all of those strings are resonating. And the similar thing is happening with an orchestra on a stage when they're in tune. All of the strings will resonate if everyone's playing in tune. And that's,
it's powerful. There's a couple of things I can think of that anyone who's watching this that either has a guitar or a piano can do to kind of demonstrate the same thing. And on a piano, it is to, hold down the keys of the piano and then sing a note really loud. Because then that note is going to resonate with the string, or same with the guitar. Like sing one of the open string notes on a guitar, and you will hear that note being coming back out of the guitar, and the string starting to vibrate the note you're singing.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, so especially way more important when you are orchestrating for live ensemble, but the same principles apply whether it's MIDI mockups or anything like that. Octaves, really safe. And I guess to kind of summarize what you're saying as well, another misconception that I remember having myself and that I've seen a lot as well is that people think that in order to get a big sound, you want a lot of different parts, while in reality, the biggest sound is arguably going to be 4 octaves of just the same melody instead of spread across as many different notes as possible and splitting up into divisi and stuff like that. So less is more, basically. So are there any things that people can do kind of immediately or change in the workflow in order to just improve the orchestrations after listening to this call that you can think of?
Well, we already said the thirds, we already said the octaves. Yeah, one thing, I just recently saw the debate on virtual orchestration forum on Facebook, is about panning of libraries. And I would say when you start out, and if you're going to follow my advice and, try the Cinematic Studio Series instruments or any of the Spitfire symphonic instruments, or even the East-West ones, most of them are recorded in a hall. So the violins are already usually staged on the left side of the concert hall or the recording hall. And you have the 3 mics in the middle. And so when they record it in stereo, of course, the violins will already be on the left. So there's no need of panning them. And when people like pan their violins, and the worst thing that I see people doing is they want the second violins on the right. So what they do is they pan the second violins all the way to the right. But what they're actually doing is they're also panning the whole concert hall. And like, it's something that's like, it's just hard to, they're basically forming, we can think of a 3-dimensional space into a 2-dimensional space. And then putting reverb on that. So that's like something that basically cannot be replicated in real life. And they're doing it in a DAW because it's possible. And of course, it's not going to sound natural. So if the one thing that you can do that you just can't make your mock-up sound great and you don't know why, look at your mixer and see if you're panning anything.
Mhm.
And if you have like libraries that are recorded in halls, get rid of all the panning, everything,
Good
and then
advice.
see how it sounds.
Yeah, and that's really good advice. So
So if you do panning, I would say max like 10%.
yeah,
Like,
I guess you can also get some like phase problems as well when you're starting to mess with that stereo space. But the only exception that I can't really encounter much anymore is when you kind of throw all kinds of realism out the window and it's mixed with a lot of other like synths and modern instruments and all kinds of stuff
yeah.
that's not an orchestra, and you just want to maybe get some kind of more separation that is not supposed to be a real orchestra, then
Mhm.
maybe. But then you have to literally throw all realism out the window and treat it almost like a synthesizer or another instrument.
Yeah.
Mm.
So what you can do, and I haven't found a plugin that would do it, and I think it's a bit of a gap. And if anyone knows if this will go on YouTube and anyone knows about this kind of plugin, let me know. But for example, if you want your second violins, you can't stand them on the left and you want to put them on the right. Write your piece, and then when you're finished, bounce the second violins into a WAV file. And then in Cubase, there's an option you can go processes and you go stereo flip, and you flip the left right channel, meaning that you basically do a mirror image of the concert hall. So your second violins will appear on the right then, and you're basically not messing up the space because you're just mirroring it. So even if you want your clarinets are on the left and you really want them on the right, I would do the same thing, just stereo flip it.
It's kind of like they're playing from the upside down in Stranger Things all of a sudden. Everything's just flipped. Yeah, no, that's an interesting approach. I kind of have to try that just to see what it sounds like in context. That's something I would like to try. So one thing that I really like about like your workflow is the MeHaRyTe or MeHaRyTe method that you have.
Yeah.
For those that don't know what that is, can you briefly just explain what it is and how it works really briefly?
Yeah. So let's say, yeah, I'll just explain it. I can do a metaphor. So this method came out of how I thought of orchestral writing, because I had a wish of writing for orchestra ever since I was like 9 years old, but I'm not very musically talented per se. People that maybe listen to my music or go to my workshops would think otherwise, but I don't consider myself very musically talented. I had to figure out kind of loopholes how to help myself in writing orchestral music. And I was listening to Tchaikovsky and I just like couldn't figure it out how he makes all the woodwinds sound so lovely and flourishing while having the strings playing a beautiful melody. And I just couldn't figure it out how it all works together. And then I realized that I can um, dissect orchestral writing into different parts. So you have the melody, you have the harmony, you have the texture, which is the texture is the most ambiguous out of all of the four segments. We have melody, harmony, rhythm, texture. So the texture is what I call everything that's going on in the background of the orchestration that is not your primary focus as a listener. It's usually the melody. And the texture is what's in the background that makes it interesting. And then you also have the rhythm, which can be like a snare drum, like in Ravel's Bolero, for example, or you can have like strings playing dum ba da dum ba da dum ba da da dum. I would also call that, for example, rhythm. So this method helped me figure out how the orchestra works, but I didn't call it the MeHaRyTe method until I started working with you guys, and I had to put a name to my logic, to my thinking, how I thought the orchestra works. And I'm very pleased that my logic and my thinking is actually helping other people out. Because not everyone is a musical genius and just grasp like all of these different knowledges, if I can put it into plural.
Yeah, it's a very
In a blink of an eye. Like a lot of most of us need like a cheat sheet, and this is basically, you can think of it as in a way than a cheat sheet, a starting point. I hear people just saying, "Oh, I was intimidated by the orchestra, and then I read some of your articles, and watched some of your workshops, and then I was like, now I kind of understand, and that's the whole point.
Yeah, I feel the genius with the method is that you're taking something that's really complex and that has a lot of kind of literature and rules and so on around it through many years, and that is a massive ensemble. It can be 60 musicians with 10 to 20 different instruments, and then you're sitting there and you're thinking like, how on earth am I going to arrange this for all these different people? What do I give to that person, that instrument, this instrument? And what you're doing is that you're basically just throwing all that complexity out the window and just focusing on four key areas: the melody, the harmony, rhythm, and texture, and kind of starting there and then assigning roles to all those different key components of the music. And it's just infinitely like less daunting and overwhelming to work with, and I think that's why it's resonating so well with a lot of our students.
Yep. Well, I'm really glad that I'm able to help people out.
Well, you certainly are, and you got some really interesting courses with us on Evenant, like on our platform. And what are some of the key things through both Orchestration Reloaded and your workshops? What are some key things that you hope that people take away from them and that you seek to kind of help with in these courses specifically?
Well, maybe like the key thing is just taking away that kind of stage fright that we were talking about. Like, how am I going to manage this? Like, how am I going to, I have this beautiful piano piece written. I want to write it for orchestra. How am I going to manage this? So always my goal was that anyone that knows how to, write a melody and put some chords onto it, that after they watch my workshops and courses, they'll be able to transfer that melody into a full orchestral piece. And I know it's a huge undertaking, but as far as I've been reading the reviews and listening to the students' pieces, I think we quite succeeded in that. So I'm very proud and happy with the accomplishments of the students.
Definitely. Yeah, you've done an incredible job with both the methods and the courses that you've done with us. So I'm really happy with them.
Thank you. Me too.
Yeah, and thank you for coming on and doing this little talk. There's a lot of really helpful advice in there. So I really appreciate it.
Thank you, Arn.